to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for this very nostalgic introduction. Yes, we were able to think about my Iowa days, which are, yeah, it's been a while. So thank you so much for allowing me to share. Like Jason said, some of the research that really has intrigued me over the years. And this is a practice talk for my first plenary. So I would love to get your take on things. Obviously, the research, that's the main thing, but also just, anything about the talk. I'm presenting a very similar presentation with preliminary results from a different task that I was just telling the group. The results are interesting and puzzling, and I still don't know what to make of it. So that plenary talk will take place about 2 weeks from now. I do want to thank Jason for the idea to use this forum to bounce ideas from, to get your honest takes on the presentation. But in the interest of time, I will just jump right in. Now, the overarching goal of the research I'll be talking about today is to better understand whether external interfaces like the syntax pragmatic interface are either areas of struggle or maybe convergence. And I will go further to say that maybe it's the opposite of struggle, but I'll let you guys decide and tell you my idea about it. My most modest goal for the talk, for the plenary talk, is twofold. First is to introduce the concept of information structure. We do have a lot of graduate students at HLS, so I imagine that many of them are not going to be familiar with it. I will draw some connections between information structure and cognition, which is why some of us are thinking of using ERPs for this research. But most of the time that we'll spend together today will be spent looking at results. So if this isn't your main research area, I'll take a moment here to basically bring you up to speed, especially when I discuss how information structure is marked in Romance languages, and particularly Spanish. My more ambitious goal is to pique your interest, basically, so that if you don't do research in bilingualism, maybe you can start thinking about how information structure interacts with anything that you're doing, because anything within language has to happen in some information structure context. And then I will close briefly, basically just thinking about what next for information structure studies and what I think point to exciting directions for the future research in the field. So I'll start with the thing that fascinates me the most about language, the fact that right now, some of you are in the UK, in Norway, and I'm originally from Mexico. And yet, you guys have no problem understanding me in my second language. So understanding language in real time is remarkably fast. Proficient speakers process input across domains within just 100 milliseconds. And this awe-inspiring fact is really what keeps me up at night and drives the shape of my research days. Because comprehension unfolds incrementally, we don't wait until the end of a sentence to interpret anything. Instead, we use our linguistic knowledge to anticipate what's coming next. Now, these expectations are not just shaped by grammar or frequency, but by context, discourse context. So how information is packaged, which complicates the situation because there are many ways to say the same thing, many ways to present a proposition. So this is where information structures comes in. It tells us whether something is being presented as new information or as given information. And this is not just a matter of style. As Krivka reminds us, these distinctions systematically reflect how speakers perceive and organize the world around them. So I wanted to show you an exchange that I had with my youngest daughter, whom I'm affectionately going to call Thing 2, when we were in Mexico last summer. We had both ordered different things, and since this sadly was her first time in Mexico, many items on the menu looked very new and intriguing to her. We were in a large group, so we placed our order separately. She was in one corner, I was in the other corner. When her food arrived, in typical fashion, she proudly announced to everyone that she had made an excellent choice, and then yelled across the table to ask what I had ordered in English. Now, one of the joys, or the quiet joys of being both a linguist and a parent, is that you can run harmless little experiments with your children, which I do all the time. So I told her that I had gotten the pozole, which is an answer to this. It's a Mexican soup, but I deliberately stressed the wrong word. Instead of saying I ordered the pozole, I said I got the pozole. And the result was instant confusion. She actually told me across the table, why do you always say things weird? She immediately picked up the prosodic mismatch because I was supposed to stress the object in English, right? And I stressed the verb. So that tiny shift in emphasis, just moving the stress from a word to another, was enough to throw off her interpretation basically completely. So why the confusion? Well, because she opened a variable with the word what. She was expecting me to fill with pozole, which I did, but instead of stressing it, I stressed the verb. So in other words, the information structure and the prosody didn't line up. And we typically expect prosodic prominence, the stress, to fall on the element that carries focus or the new information in English. When that expectation is violated, even in a simple exchange like this one, the result is infelicity. If I know my daughter like I think I do, she would have reacted very differently had I stressed the rice constituency. If I had said I ordered the pozole with the stress on the right word and the accusative object, she would have immediately shown interest in my food, as I know her, probably wanting to try it. That's because in that version, the prosody aligns with the discourse expectations and the focus matches the what question and everything clicks. So without saying anything, I basically introduced the notion of focus. So in the interest of being academic and formal, let's start with a formal definition of focus. And I like a couple of definitions, and Lambrecht's passive definition I think it's great. So basically for Lambrecht, focus is information that cannot be taken for granted. It's unpredictable, it's pragmatically non-recoverable. In short, it's what updates the listener's knowledge in the conversation. Krifke and others have pointed out to this definition is very helpful, but also Ruth's definition as one of the most influential. That focus indicates the presence of alternatives that are relevant for interpretation. I really like this view because it highlights that focus isn't just about adding new information, it's about introducing alternatives that the listener could consider. It also accounts for different ways of marking focus through prosody, syntax, or word order. So overall, for us to remember, focus helps manage information. It signals what's new, what's contrastive, and what matters more for interpretation. And for short, most people just call it new information. But, the story's a little more complex than that. So let's look at a simple example to make this concrete. Here, the sentences are identical. So thing one is what I like to call my oldest daughter. And we have the same proposition 3 times, right? There's the thing one, there's a holding, action, and there's a hamster. So in the first one, which would be the answer to which thing held a hamster, the focus falls on the subject. So the answer would be thing one held a hamster. So in English, you would expect that to have prosodic prominence. In the second, what did thing one hold? The focus is on the object, the hamster. And in the third, the focus would be on the predicate or on the verb held. So again, notice that the propositional content doesn't change. It's still about thing one, it's still about holding, it's still about holding a hamster. What changes here is the pragmatic use of focus, what part of the sentence is being highlighted as new or contrastive information. So the difference lies not in what's being said, but how the information is packaged for interpretation. So far we've seen that focus highlights what's new or relevant, but not all focus is creative equal. Broadly speaking, we can distinguish between 2 main types of focus or pragmatic uses of focus, information focus and contrastive focus. Information focus fills a gap. So when we had, what did you get? The answer, right? What did you order? Pozole. That's the element that fills the gap, the variable that's open. Contrastive focus, on the other hand, does 2 things at a time. It opens a variable and closes the variable, inviting comparison or contrast. And I'm going to get into this into a little bit more detail since the research is about this. So following this definition, information focus is the non-presupposed part of the sentence that's relevant for interpretation and closes a variable. So for example, in this sentence in Spanish, sorry, can you see the sentence? Yes, you can. Okay. If you ask something like, who was your inspiration? And you answer, sin duda fue mi abuelo, right? Mi abuelo is the focus because it resolves the variable opened by quién, which is who. Different language signal this prominence in different ways. So English would do it through prosody. I would say, my grandfather, was, whatever. But in Spanish, we use syntax. We can use a variety of things, as a matter of fact, but syntax is one of the resources that we have. So we can place the focus element towards the right edge of the clause. And actually, I was introduced to this in one of Jason's classes when he presented Zubizarreta's work, and I actually didn't like the sentences, and that's what started this whole thing. So the focus, it's what's new, it's informative in the exchange, of the piece that completes the question and updates the listener's knowledge. Now, contrastive focus, I'm going to give you an example in Spanish, but in English, we have something very, very similar. Unlike information focus, which, like I said, closes a variable, this one opens and closes a variable at the same time. So if we look at this example, so you called Pedro, the answer could be a Juan llamé, a Pedro no. So even if you don't understand the words, you heard that Juan came like with a special little force, right? Because the focus on Juan doesn't just add the new information of who this person is, it corrects or contrasts with what came before. So contrastive focus tends to carry meanings of correction, exhaustivity, or contrast, and is often marked prosodically in Spanish, syntactically also. In Spanish, it can appear at the left edge of the sentence and carry this special stress. At this point, I want to shift gears a little bit to talk about attention. At the basic level, attention is the brain's ability to tune in to certain stimuli while ignoring others. It is a dynamic, context-driven process. What we notice or prioritize depends on the relevance and expectation. So for example, right now, if you're listening to me, you have to make sense of my words and my slides and everything else, but your body is also noticing the temperature of the room, whether your left shoe is tighter than the right shoe, or whether your hair is bothering you in some way. All of these things are there and we're recording them, but you're choosing to pay attention to one thing, right? So I bring this up here because attention is central to information structure. Focus, by definition, directs the listener's attention to the most relevant or newsworthy part of the utterance. So ERP research actually gives us some evidence for these links. Students like Bornkasten et al., which are actually pretty old, found that she did this research in 2003. She found that when a constituent is in focus, the brain shows a positive response around 300 to 500 milliseconds after it's heard, and this positivity, which they label a P3, seems to reflect a shift in attention, which happens when we recognize something that's contextually expected element. So later work, like in 2016, also from that same group, suggested that this positivity might reflect not just integration, but a general reorientation of attention to salient or prominent events, whether it's a focus, a clefted phrase, or even something like hearing your own name in a context where you don't expect it. So overall, these findings highlight the possibility that attention and information structure are deeply intertwined, that focus doesn't just organize information linguistically, like I've shown you, that it literally may just capture attention at the neural level. So when we talk about attention, we're really talking about selective attention, our ability to concentrate on one thing while tuning out everything else. And the brain can manage this through a balance of two processes. And you know this well, top-down attention driven by our expectations and goals. And this is where discourse comes in, right? This is what let us focus on what's relevant or predicted. And the second is bottom-up attention, which is an automatic response to something salient or unexpected in the environment, something like stress in situ. Both processes are constantly interacting, obviously, which is key to how I attend to linguistic cues like focus, because like I said, the what question sets up the top-down attention, but the prosody, right, does the bottom-down processing because we are actually marking something in the signal. And that helps us filter out what's less relevant. So the brother or sister of focus is topic. So it's a counterpart, the logical counterpart. In general terms, a topic refers to what the sentence is about. The point of departure for the message. It's the element that's already active or salient, and often because of this, it's realized by pronouns or unstressed phrases. And in languages like mine, right, we don't have to say anything because we are null subject languages. So you can think of it as the X and tell me about X. Casillas Suarez summarized it nicely, basically said topics are what already is on the table, the shared or old information that the speaker builds on to introduce something new. That said, I'm simplifying horribly because defining topic precisely has proven notoriously difficult, with scholars often disagreeing on even its core properties and boundaries. And so in general, we call this older given information, but again, take it with a grain of salt because it's a very nuanced thing. And actually, the definition I just gave, I lied a little because it only applies to what we call thematic topics, the aboutness topics that signals what the sentence is really centered on. So just like we had contrast be a primitive that alters focus, so we can have information focus and contrastive focus, we can do the same with topic. There's a second time, there's contrastive topics, which interact both with kind of topic and focus. They shift the topic from one element to another, essentially contrasting alternatives in the discourse. And I'll show you some examples about this. And actually, Jason's works when he was at Iowa with subject pronoun expression really focused on that as well. So here's an example of thematic topic in Spanish. In the sentence, a Scheinbaum le eligieron en 2024, this phrase, a Scheinbaum, who's the president of Mexico, is a topic. It's a point of departure. So this would only be felicitous if this entity is already salient in the discourse, if we're talking about Mexico or presidents or elections or something like that. Spanish often marks topics through this structure, which is called Clitic Left Dislocation. We see it here. The dislocated phrase, which is a Scheinbaum, is doubled by a clitic la, which it agrees and gender and number. And the combination of syntax and morphology, syntax through the dislocation, morphology through the clitic, signals that the phrase is already known or given information and setting the stage for what comes next. Contrastive topic, we're going to have one example here because unlike thematic topics, contrastive topics are kind of fascinating because they seem to straddle both topic and focus. They mark what the sentence is about while also introducing an alternative or contrast. So for example, in this sentence, Oscar is my brother, Oscar no lavó los trastes, lo hice yo. The contrastive topic helps us move the discourse from one referent to another. And even though in Spanish I could, have null subjects, it would be completely infelicitous for me to say, Oscar no lavó los trastes, lo hice. Like, there's nowhere to stress there. It would be infelicitous in this context. So contrastive topics help us move the discourse from a referent to the next. And because I actually have never done research on contrastive topic, I will not go into details in this presentation, but they do play a very important role in how speakers manage the alternatives and emphasis in discourse, and I should really do some research with it as well. So anyway, I want to answer the question of why you're listening to this at all. So if you are interested in bilingualism, why do topic and focus structure matter at all? Well, because they have been posited to be really, really hard to acquire in a second language. And this difficulty has been linked to the external interface, those points where the syntax interacts with the discourse and pragmatics. And there's many hypotheses that have been proposed, but I'm going to talk about three very briefly. The first one, which Tania named as the structural overlap hypothesis, and Mueller and Holt's work, argues that when two languages in a bilingual's brain interact at this interface, bilinguals will misanalyze forms, leading to negative transfer. So if the combination of languages interact in the right way, they might not be able to overcome this difficulty. The interface hypothesis, which is due to Sorachi and colleagues, builds in this distinction between the internal and external interfaces to suggest that external interfaces are challenging, not because of the L1, it doesn't matter, it's not the structural overlap, it's nothing about that. It's because, and it's not even missing knowledge, but it's the difficulty with integration of syntax and discourse in real time that requires processing effort. So it's like a byproduct of bilingualism. And lastly, we have Gruder et al. With the RIDGE hypothesis, which is a wonderful name, reduced ability to generate expectations, proposed that non-native speakers show a reduced ability to generate predictive expectations during processing at this interface as well. So together, you see that these accounts highlight how linguistic and cognitive demands seem to converge at the interface and making it particularly difficult for bilinguals. So this is the meat of the research. So we have the notions, the hypothesis. So what now? I'm just going to do a very selective overview of the topic. I'm going to review 3 of these 4 information structure primitives: thematic topic, contrastive focus, and information focus, using different experimental methods. Again, this overview is highly selective because it highlights areas that interest me personally, and it draws from the research that I've conducted over the last several years, and like Jason said, a decade, basically. So we've already talked about thematic topics, so I'll just highlight a couple of things here. With Clitic Left Dislocation, we have a dislocated phrase with an agreeing clitic, and we have the accusative marker, the differential object marker that marks the dislocated phrase as the object. So if it's human and specific, it has to have this marker. And in most of the research that we will see, we use plus human subjects to make it completely unambiguous that we have a Clitic Left Dislocation and not a hanging topic, which is, I didn't get into it, but it's difficult to distinguish. So just for clarity's sake, we're only going to talk about humans here. The last thing I want to talk about is that while CLLD isn't especially common in the discourse, they're not rare either. There are a couple of corpus, and they seem to appear in about 2% of utterances. So again, not exceedingly rare. There's a lot of research, and I'm going to cite some of the research that Jason and Rumiana have done together here with clitic dislocations in Spanish. And I want to focus on the methods right now because I want to see if there's a difference by method. So first we had testing of plain vanilla CLLD. So this is just CLLD that is in main clause. There's nothing special about it. I think they did nominal phrases, right? And it looks at the basic left dislocation on their own. Then after, I finished my PhD, I started understanding that it could combine with all sorts of different structures, with fronted focus, WH questions, and iterative topics. I mean, these are things that you're not going to find in a corpus. They're very rare combinations. And then I decided to do it with embedded CLLD, again, in structures that are not as common: subjunctive complements, devolutional predicates, temporal adverbial clauses, and sentential subjects. And then Sequeiros Valle et al. Used some of the materials that we had developed to test the plain vanilla CLLD and use a speeded production to test it. And I wanted to include also some work on right dislocation, or CLRD, just because it's a much rarer structure where the dislocated object, instead of appearing in the left, would appear on the right and still carrying an agreeing clitic. So this is actually from Slovakova and Rothman and Kemchinsky's work. And I just wanted to show you the method to see how this was done. And it takes me back to my Iowa days coding in HTML for the first time. So basically, you have the idea of a context with the text and the audio, and two options that also carry audio. And this is basically not a forced choice, but it's an alternative choice. And they would rate each one of them. Here, something that was very important early on is that we realized that the audio component was crucial, because Rumiana had been working with Ivan Ivanov on Bulgarian, and it showed that the text alone wasn't enough to capture the prosodic cues that distinguish felicitous from infelicitous options, so everything was recorded. So the rest of the research uses that paradigm, more or less, or acceptability judgment tasks. So I just wanted to show you the overall results, because the convergence was absolutely possible in all of them, even with the rare CLLD, with sentential subjects in combination with WH questions. We did get there are some mixed results in the literature with speeded production. There was lack of convergence there. And also, at this point, I should say that RAGE and IH, the interface hypothesis, predict that this difficulty was happening in online processing. So even though we show convergence overall across all these studies, it wasn't enough to say, well, the IH or RAGE are wrong, right? And that's where we started thinking about, well, how to test information structure with online methods, which at the time had only been done in the L1 in a couple of languages, I believe Russian. So anyway, those frameworks make explicit predictions about online processing, about what happens when the sentence unfolds in real time. So this is what we explored with Rumiana Slovakova and Thomas Farmer, who was a student of Florian Jaeger, a postdoc of Florian Jaeger. And we asked whether L2 learners could generate linguistic expectations during the processing of clitic left dislocation. And we tested a bunch of learners and native speakers, and we used self-paced reading tasks, right, which manipulated the presence or absence of clitics. And I'm going to show you an example of a self-paced reading task just a little bit later. So what we found here, because we were testing specifically prediction, whether they could expect the agreeing clitic once they saw the dislocated phrase, we found that natives absolutely slowed down when an expected clitic was missing. And these were verbs that could take the clitics or not take the clitics. So the sentence was not ungrammatical, they were only infelicitous. And they show very strong predictive expectations. L2 learners also predicted. But these effects came stronger with proficiency. And something very important, at least for CLLD, is that what mattered was study abroad experience, not classroom time. Classroom time did not predict native-like processing, but study abroad experience. So together, basically, this finding suggests what I'm going to keep reminding you of, which is predictive processing and just processing at the interface can be fine-tuned over the course of L2 learning. So the answer is not a no, but like later if you're going to process native-like. This study that we did with CLLD, we wanted to see whether or not they were actually exposed to CLLD in the classroom. So we looked at whether it was ever taught or used, and we surveyed teachers, we reviewed textbooks, we analyzed the corpus of advanced classes. I think we had about 6 or 7 hours of classes just to see whether CLLD was produced. And what we found was teachers were largely unaware of CLLD. They judged it right because we gave them a grammatically judgment task, but they never taught it. And they had the oddest type of comments about this. They said that it was redundant, informal, not proper language. But basically, the idea was this is not the subject of instruction. We should not be teaching this. Yet we saw earlier that they get it. Even though the textbooks contained no CLLD tokens, there were 2 textbooks and there was 1 example in each out of the 18. So we saw that they can totally process it native-like. So the takeaway here is that the acquisition of the structure seemed to be driven by naturalistic exposure, really not by formal instruction, because the formal instruction wasn't happening. They weren't teaching it. They didn't think it was worthy of instruction. They didn't use it. And, and they still got it, which is amazing. So in terms of the interim summary, is the interface necessarily a site of struggle? When it comes to thematic topic, it doesn't seem to be the case, despite these structures being absent from classroom input. I mean, this is CLLD, which is a frequent one. CLRD is not even represented anywhere. So we would not expect even teachers to know this. So we do find that naturalistic exposure in the contextual information is very helpful. But we did find one little snag with the speed of production. And that is also true. So at this point, we have to start saying, like, if this is a comparative type of hypothesis building, that the difficulty is at this interface, we're seeing that in morphosyntax, because my second life as a researcher has been doing a lot of research of acquisition of French. And morphosyntax is incredibly difficult, whether your L1 is, English or Spanish or whatever. So this doesn't seem exactly surprising. Let's move into contrastive focus really, really quickly, which is a non-presupposed part of the sentence that, as we saw, opens and closes a variable. This is the example we saw before. So I just wanted to point out a couple of things. We also have a dislocated phrase, but we don't have the agreeing clitic. So we have a Juan llamé, not a Juan lo llamé, right? So the prosody changes, it fits a different information structure context, etc. And we still have the differential object marker. And this is pretty rare. We could not find utterances in a corpus, and in the teacher corpus that we built, there was only 1 example. It was very iffy because we actually didn't, we had the recording, but we couldn't analyze it prosodically because, we had a lot of stops. So it was very iffy whether or not it was produced exactly as we expected it. So in Spanish, we used bimodal forced choice acceptability judgment test. This is work also with Jason. In this case, we shifted the focus to heritage bilinguals, right? Because it had been proposed that many of these things affected just L2 speakers. So all the research up to this point has been with adult learners of a language, but now we're focused on heritage bilinguals. We are child bilinguals. And we did those speakers who grew up with Spanish at home, but were now English dominant. And we compared 3 groups of native speakers, monolingual Spanish speakers, Spanish dominant bilinguals who were in the US, and heritage speakers, which also native speakers, but English dominant, right? And interestingly, we found really no differences between the groups. You see here, this is the difference between the felicitous and infelicitous context. There's some differences here that are, you can see them numerically, but they were not statistically significant. So heritage speakers really pattern just like the native speakers, whether monolingual or bilingual. So again, this is not a structure that works exactly in the same way in English and Spanish. So that was interesting to see. There's just 2 studies that I know of with L2ers and ERPs. One of them is Pepe Alemán Bañón, who is a very, very clever study. And also the one that fits in this presentation a little better is a contrasted focus in French with ERPs, which Reifle and Birdsong did with French. And the design is also very clever. The participants saw sentences like these, and I know it's hard to read, but they saw a picture. Here you see a hammer on top of a table. And they would have to, they just listen to these sentences and they would be under different informational contexts. So the first one would be a contrastive focus context. something like est-ce qu'un verre ou un marteau qu'on voit sur la table? So is it a glass or a hammer that we see on the table? Versus the question for information focus that what do we see? C'est quoi qu'on voit sur la table, right? What do we see on the table? And the same sentence then can be felicitous or infelicitous, kind of depending on the preceding question. I mean, it's the same one, but we'd expect a different reaction to this target center, which is the same for all of them. And they had some filler conditions that they didn't analyze, obviously. So the target sentence would be, it's a hammer that we see on the table, right? C'est un marteau qu'on voit sur la table. And the results turn out really, really nice. They didn't see differences between the two groups. And what is really nice is that you see the increased negativity and contrastive focus and context that support information focus. So there's a difference between the two. So that's that was nice to see, but we need more studies like this, basically. So when it comes to contrastive focus, again, is this a site of struggle? Well, no, both by model judgment data and ARP data show convergence. Proficiency mattered, especially for the lifeless study. We don't have production data, so we don't know how that turns out. And we really have very little studies that are online with ERPs with L2ers. Now I'm going to move on to the thing that has been keeping me busy for the most time, which is focusing on information focus. Most of the work that you will see here, I have done in collaboration with Brad Hoot. Back in grad school, we did a presentation at ASRL, and we were put in the same session back to back, and we basically did the same study with different methods, which was amazing. We had almost identical questions about information structure. We just were working independently. So it's been really gratifying to keep collaborating all these years, trying to answer those same questions together. So these series of studies use forced choice, which I will show you, and self-paced reading tasks to test how speakers process information focused in Spanish. But we have done all sorts of focus. We have done subject focus, object focus, adjunct focus, with clitics, without clitics. We've examined native speakers, L2 speakers, stable bilinguals, Catalan Spanish and Yucatec Maya Spanish, and also heritage speakers of Spanish and English. So I want to talk a little bit about forced choice tasks again, because my focus is a little bit to focus on the methodology that we used. In a forced choice task, participants typically see nearly two identical sentences and simply choose the one that sounds better in context, an A or B type of response. That binary setup helps reduce cognitive load, especially compared to rating scales. It's also a very sensitive tool because it can detect fine-grained distinctions, and Sprouse and Almeida have done a lot of work showing that. And because participants are comparing rather than rating, this method minimize biases, like anchoring effects, right? Staying on one side of the scale, or inconsistent use from item to item. So here's an example. Participants would see a short scenario like this one with the question, ¿Quién perdió la joya? And because you really need a context, we drew a bunch of pictures so that it would be a little bit easier, and it worked fairly well. And then they choose between two options. In this case, you have an embedded clause. I think that lost the ring, the queen, or lost the queen, the ring. So this helps us test whether word order preferences in this context while keeping the task simple and natural. And the other one is self-paced reading. You probably know it very well. Nearly identical sentences. We use moving windows. We record latencies between button presses. And of course, we can also present the context, the non-moving context, and then we can do the self-paced segments. So because the task is self-paced, we record latencies between button presses, and it lets us test how participants integrate information across clauses in real time. Now, with this one, there's no rereading, right? So we don't have those measures here. So anyway, these are the kinds of results that when I have a bad day, I would like to frame and put in my house, because the native speakers show, expected distinctions as we saw. These are extremely rare sentences in a corpus of, I think, 2 million words. We found one dissertation at Indiana found 2 examples of VOS, no examples of VSO. And yet, look at this beautiful, beautiful graphs for the L2ers. Right here, this infelicity effect is huge. It looks almost like grammaticality. They were extremely sensitive to this. We were not expecting this, because honestly, I, like a native speaker of Spanish, when you give me these sentences, the one pienso que perdió la joya la reina y pienso que perdió la reina la joya. I mean, I don't like both, so I would not expect to have these underlying reaction, and yet there it is. Which is incredible in a way, because these are so rare, and yet they behave just like native speakers. Actually, the effect was a little clearer. which makes some sense because these were graduate students that were accustomed to reading, and these were native speakers of, they all had college education, but, you know, they were not being tested in the lab every week. And the forced choice task, here we chose focus on the PP just for one sample result, you know, show the same type of tendency. So we saw that online and offline. So I wanted to move to just one more method, which is the information focus with production tasks, because we have seen that production is kind of like, you know, maybe a little bit of an outlier. It seems to give us some trouble. So we did 2 different studies that used the speeded production, tested subject and objects focus marking. So I just want to show you a token of what they saw. Hopefully you can hear it. If not, there's nothing. Oh, no, you can't hear it. Yeah. So they saw the video, right? And then the question, there was a whole ruse about someone not being present and saying, because he couldn't see the video, Alfredo wants to know what did the girl hang, right? And we were expecting, you know, the skirt or the dress or whatever. And I just realized that I have my AirPods. So I will try to see if I can disconnect them really quickly. Did I stop sharing?
No, you're still.
No, you're still there. Okay, so let me try to disconnect my AirPods really quickly, just so you can hear the audio. Okay, it seems like the audio settings changed, so hopefully you can hear it. Okay, I change it to the speakers. Wait, let's see if we can hear it. This is a production speaker answering with a cleft. One more time, just because I wanted to hear you. If you're doing intonation, I think you're going to hear some interesting things that I would like you to comment on. And if I can do it, then that's okay. Oh, you know what it is? I can't do it because if it'll do it automatically. Teams said that I have to do it twice, that I have to like log out, and I don't want to. Did it change? Let me try. Nope. Okay, that's, oh yeah, it did. Okay, let me see. Let me see if we can hear it now.
Quien tiró los platos al piso fue el vagabundo.
Right, so you see, quien tiró los platos al piso fue el vagabundo. That's a cleft. So the one who threw the, you know, the plates on the ground was the vagabundo, the tramp.
El hombre del bigote puso el plato sobre la mesa.
And this is a canonical order. Okay, excellent. So the idea that we had was to elicit the spontaneous responses under time pressure. So we used these video clips from Chaplin the Circus. We told participants a little ruse. Somebody had missed the movie and was now asking all sorts of questions about what had happened. So yeah, we played the tokens and the sample responses, and we can see the results, hopefully. So even though we have seen that production is difficult, learners and natives largely use similar strategies for almost every context. We do have one difference in the object focus that I'm going to show you. But the result from this that we realized is that canonical orders seem to fit almost every information structure situation that we tested with information focus. And we also had fillers with verum focus, and they behave in the same way. And we had broad focus. And so canonical in Spanish seems to be good for everything. Some alternatives were produced, most notably clefts for subject focus, which actually mirrors a lot of the research that has been done in French. But we really need more work involving prosody, because we didn't control for prosody, right? Because it was just spontaneous. They could use whatever words, and there were a lot of stops for us to do prosody. But it's interesting because it didn't look like the patterns that we were expecting from English or Spanish reported before were happening here. So this is for subject focus. The green, the only thing I want to show you is that the green one is canonical order. It by far trumps everything else. There were no statistical differences. And there were little differences here in one category, movement final. Most of them still choose in C2, right? SVOPP is the preferred order, but native speakers were able to shift a la Suizarreta, right? And produce something like SVPPO, right? Puso en el tendedero la falda or something like that, which learners did, but to a much lower extent. So this suggests that what a learner might understand and even anticipate focus-driven structures. Producing them fluently is another story, especially for object focus, not for subject focus. That seems to be fine. But this highlights really the need for more research on production, which is more or less unexplored in interface phenomena like this. So just to bring it all together, what do we find with information focus? Well, the data really show convergence. Proficiency was found to modulate the effect, but not always. With the self-paced reading, proficiency didn't turn out to be significant. So they did it from the get-go and they did it well. But we do have few studies with production, and the results largely, sorry, I'm trying to move here. They're consistent across methods and populations. And they have been remarkably consistent, across these differences. Sorry, I'm trying to, yeah. So what is the story here? Stepping back, overall, what did these results tell us? So for a long time, work at the syntax discourse interface has been all about the struggle. It's been framed in terms of what learners cannot do. The idea that the structures are simply too demanding for bilingual grammars. It's hard enough to get the syntax. How are you going to get the syntax and the discourse? But that's not what we see here necessarily, right? I have not presented some of the research that I do with morphosyntax. That looks even more dire sometimes. What we see here looks like dynamic fine-tuning. And learners and heritage speakers do not seem to fail at this, integrating syntax and semantics and discourse. They seem to recalibrate through experience. Obviously, there's a lot of avenues to explore. The role of canonical orders, at least in Spanish, which seem to accommodate most information structure situations and might reduce the need for more marked configurations. In short, if SVO will do it, then why would you do anything else, right? As a learner, if you're never going to be corrected, nobody's ever going to give you negative evidence for this. Also, looking at the influence of the method and the type of pressures that the measure gets. And this idea that with increased exposure and proficiency, bilinguals show greater alignment across methods and populations, suggesting this system that's adaptive and responsive rather than deficient. So really, rather than a site of breakdown, after all these years, I'm kind of ready to say that the external interface might actually give you experience-driven fine-tuning. So it might give you a leg up, really. A reflection of the remarkable flexibility of bilingual grammars. And it makes some sense, and that's why I started with the work on attention. If what focuses is drives our attention to a certain segment, we could probably exploit it to get the syntax and the morphology from it. There have been in SLA a couple of proposals about attention and all these attentional resources that are necessary for acquisition. Well, that's what focus does. And topic also builds on that because the whatever topicalized phrase has to be salient in the discourse. So what if, instead of saying that the interface is sites of struggle, actually discourse might make things easier by focusing our attention on something. So that's basically what I want to test next. So what's next in the area? On the method side, we have to, I think, as a field, expand towards neurolinguistic evidence. It's just, there's not a dearth of study in L1. We find studies in Japanese, English, German, Kachika. There's a bunch of things. But in the L2 world, we really have very little. So we convinced Dave Miller from Jason's Lab fame, and we convinced him to work with us on this, and we submitted a register report, which I have to say anecdotally has been very hard to place because people who work in ERPs don't work in information structure, and information structure folks don't work in ERPs. So there's a lot of misunderstanding about what you can and cannot do with both fields, which I think sets us back a little bit. It's been an interesting experience to do this register report because this is our third time going around. And both times it has been kind of a desk reject, which is an interesting thing for us. So what we want to clarify with this work particularly is the conflicting findings between the P3 component that I mentioned, which signals attention, and the N400 components that has been found also for information structure. And we hope that this will shed light on not only how bilinguals process focus in real time, but also about the components themselves. In general, really, more online methods would be ideal. So another task that I'm doing is a cross-model priming task. That is, I was just telling the folks before we started, is replicating the work of Ann Cutler and its phoneme monitor monitoring under focus context, and the results are not matching hers. So that's very interesting so far. The other thing is that I had to do a state-of-the-art review for a handbook that Rumiana edited, and I realized how little we know about child bilinguals. So we really don't know when they acquired these. I mean, there's some work with corpus, existent corpus, and there's some work on focus with on accusative verbs. But beyond that, we really have very little experimental stuff with child bilinguals. So in collaboration with Naomi Sheen, we plan to test Arizona bilinguals because we're right by the border. We're 60 miles from it, and children in Mexico to see how they mark focus with unaccusatives and negatives. We're using puppets and videos, and we're trying to see how the sensitivity develops across the linguistics environments because they're both, we hope that both groups will be bilingual, but obviously one of them is going to be Spanish dominant and the other one English dominant, so we'll see. On the language side, a group of us recently edited a special issue on experimental approaches to information structure. And what we found is that most of the research clusters, and you'll see the graph here that Joseph Casillas did for us, in 4 languages. So English by far, right? Mandarin, some German and Spanish, and then everything else. So we have, and the light, things here are work on bilingualism. So you find that, we have some in English, a little bit in Mandarin, a little bit in Spanish, but not that much. So, and this is not obviously online necessarily work. This is just work in general. So anyhow, this reminds us how much linguistic diversity needs to be explored. And hopefully, so one of my aims for this talk is to get people interested in this, because any structure that you're studying, whether it's agreement or whatever you want, you can do it in conditions of focus or not. And we would expect the attention tuning to differ, right? So we can get more information, both about whatever the structure is that you're studying, but also about topic and focus. And that is all I have for you today. And I really try to time it at 45 minutes because that's the time that I will have for the presentation at HLS. And I just wanted to share, I just wanted to tell Jason how much I appreciate the opportunity to hear your comments. So I'm happy to hear them.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hold on, guys.
So yeah, I will take questions, complaints, comments on the speed of presentation.